A tattered journal hidden beneath rotting floorboards revealed a decades-old secret that would restore stolen masterpieces to their rightful owners when homeless veteran Michael Hayes reluctantly accepted a $10 job cleaning an abandoned garden shed. He never imagined finding a hidden compartment containing Nazi-looted artwork worth over $400 million in a discovery that would reunite Holocaust survivors with their family treasures and ultimately transform his broken life into one of purpose and redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind whistled through the cracks of the dilapidated garden shed as Michael Hayes surveyed the task before him. At 43 years old, the former Army Ranger moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had once been trained to navigate hostile territories. Despite the stiffness in his left leg, a permanent reminder of his third tour in Afghanistan. The ramshackle structure stood at the far edge of the Wellington estate, its weathered cedar siding warped by decades of neglect, nearly consumed by the encroaching vegetation that seemed determined to reclaim the land. Another day, another hustle, Michael muttered to himself, adjusting the frayed strap of his backpack containing everything he owned in this world, before setting it carefully on a relatively dry patch of ground. The $10 promised. For this job wasn't much, but it would mean a hot meal tonight, instead of the usual offerings at St. Martin's shelter where he'd been sleeping for the past 8 months. Ever since his medical discharge 4 years ago, life had become an increasingly difficult series of temporary arrangements and disappointments. Mrs. Eleanor Wellington, an elderly widow whose family had owned this sprawling New England property for generations, had stopped him yesterday as he was leaving the public library, one of the few places that offered warmth without judgment. "You look like someone who needs work," she had said directly, without preamble or pity. Something about her straightforward manner had reminded Michael of his grandmother, making it impossible to refuse her offer of odd jobs despite the meager compensation. The garden shed stood apart from the main house, accessible via a winding path through what had once been an impressive rose garden, but was now little more than tangled briars. According to Mrs. Wellington, the structure hadn't been properly entered in at least 20 years, not since her late husband's groundskeeper had retired. "Clear it out completely," she had instructed. "Anything worth keeping, bring to the house. The rest can go to the burn pile. The shed itself is coming down next month." Michael pulled the string on the bare light bulb hanging from the rafters, surprised when it actually flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the cluttered interior. Decades of accumulated garden equipment, broken furniture, and cardboard boxes created a labyrinth of forgotten possessions, cobwebs draped like ghastly decorations from every surface, while evidence of multiple generations of rodent inhabitants crunched underfoot. "Where to even begin?" he sighed, his breath visible in the chilly autumn air. Experience had taught him that organization was crucial, especially when dealing with chaos. He began systematically, creating zones for obviously worthless items, potentially valuable finds, and questionable objects that Mrs. Wellington would need to evaluate personally. Hours passed as Michael worked methodically through the accumulated debris. His military training had instilled habits that served him well in this task: efficiency, thoroughness, and attention to detail. By mid-afternoon, he had cleared nearly half the shed, uncovering nothing more interesting than a set of antique garden shears and a collection of clay pots that had somehow survived the decades intact. The physical labor felt good, purposeful in a way too many of his days hadn't since leaving the service. Veterans Affairs had tried their best with therapy sessions and medication, but the combination of his physical injuries and the invisible wounds of PTSD had made maintaining steady employment nearly impossible. The downward spiral had been gradual, but relentless, first losing his apartment, then his car, until finally, the last of his savings had disappeared, leaving him with nothing but his military backpack and the clothes he wore. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Michael shifted a heavy wooden cabinet away from the back wall, something unusual caught his attention. Unlike the rest of the shed's rough-hewn planking, a section of the floorboards appeared different, the wood slightly newer, the spacing between boards marginally wider. Kneeling carefully to avoid aggravating his bad leg, Michael ran his fingers along the edges of the boards, feeling a slight give that shouldn't exist in a properly secured floor. "What have we here?" he murmured, retrieving a screwdriver from a rusty toolbox he'd found earlier. Using it as a makeshift pre-bar, he worked at the edge of one board until it lifted slightly. With growing curiosity, he worked his fingers under the edge and pulled, feeling a momentary resistance before the board came free, revealing darkness beneath. Michael's heart rate quickened as he removed several more boards, exposing what was unmistakably a hidden compartment beneath the shed floor. As a ranger, he discovered hidden caches in Afghanistan, sometimes containing weapons, sometimes valuables. This deliberate concealment triggered those memories, putting him instantly on alert. Using the light from his cracked but functional cell phone, Michael illuminated the space below. The hidden compartment was approximately 4 feet square and 2 feet deep, lined with what appeared to be zinc sheets protection against moisture. Inside lay several objects carefully wrapped in oilcloth and what looked like waxed canvas. The materials aged but still effectively preserving whatever they contained. With careful hands that belied his large frame, Michael extracted the first bundle from the compartment. It was surprisingly heavy, rectangular, and roughly the size of a small suitcase. As he unwrapped the protective layers, he found himself holding a metal case with an unusual locking mechanism, not rusted despite its years of concealment, suggesting it was made of high-quality materials. The lock, an intricate affair that seemed more at home on a bank vault than a storage case, gave Michael pause. Breaking into it wasn't just potentially illegal. It might damage whatever was inside. Yet something about this discovery stirred his instincts. This wasn't just forgotten junk. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide these items. Setting the case aside temporarily, Michael returned to the compartment, retrieving a smaller package that, when unwrapped, revealed a leather-bound journal. Unlike the metal case, the journal had no lock preventing its examination. The leather was cracked with age but had been preserved remarkably well in the controlled environment of the hidden space. Opening the journal with careful fingers, Michael found pages filled with meticulous handwriting and faded ink. The text appeared to be in multiple languages, some entries in English, others in what looked like German, with occasional passages in what might have been French. Dates in the upper corners of pages ranged from 1943 to 1945. Even more intriguing were the sketches and diagrams interspersed throughout detailed drawings of what appeared to be paintings and sculptures, each accompanied by extensive notes. As Michael flipped through the pages, a yellowed photograph slipped from between the leaves, falling to the floor of the shed. Picking it up, Michael found himself looking at a black and white image of a young man in what appeared to be a U.S. Army uniform standing beside a jeep. The backdrop suggested Europe during World War II. Turning the photograph over, he found an inscription: Samuel Wellington, Paris, 1945. The surname wasn't lost on Michael. Wellington, the same as the elderly woman who had hired him. The connection between this hidden cache and the family whose property he was clearing suddenly became clear. Whatever Samuel Wellington had concealed here, he had done so after returning from the European theater of World War II. Michael's gaze shifted between the journal, the photograph, and the still locked metal case. His instincts told him this was significant, potentially valuable, and certainly historical. The right thing to do was clear: inform Mrs. Wellington immediately of his discovery. Yet something made him hesitate. Not greed, but an inexplicable sense that he needed to understand more before bringing this to light. The journal in his hands felt like a message across time, and something compelled him to read at least some of it before turning everything over. Settling on a relatively clean wooden crate, Michael began to read the first entry, dated April 17, 1943. Today I witnessed something I cannot reconcile with my conscience. As an intelligence officer attached to the Monument Men, I am tasked with documenting Nazi art theft, not preventing it. Yet standing in that Parisian apartment as the Gestapo methodically catalogued and seized the Rosenberg family collection, I found myself silently complicit in a crime that goes beyond war. These are not military targets, but the systematic erasure of culture and heritage. The look in old Mr. Rosenberg's eyes as they took his beloved Monet painting that had hung in his family home for 3 generations will haunt me until my dying day. Michael's brow furrowed as he continued reading, entries becoming increasingly disturbing as Samuel Wellington documented the Nazi plunder of Jewish-owned art collections across occupied France. The journal detailed Wellington's growing moral crisis as his official role required him to observe and document while his conscience demanded intervention. Then came an entry from November 1944 that made Michael sit up straighter. What I have done cannot be disclosed, not even in these pages. The official record will show these 12 masterpieces as destroyed in transit following Allied bombing. Only I know the truth. May God forgive me for this deception, though I cannot bring myself to call it theft when the original theft was perpetrated by monsters. The Rosenberg collection will be preserved, hidden until such time as rightful heirs can be located. I carry this burden willingly, knowing the alternative was their certain disappearance into the private collection of Reichsmarschall Gring. Michael's hands trembled slightly as the implications became clear. Samuel Wellington, serving with the Allied forces tasked with documenting Nazi art theft, had apparently intercepted stolen artwork and concealed it, presumably with the intention of eventually returning it to its rightful owners. And now, decades later, that hidden collection was potentially sitting in the metal case beside him. The gravity of the situation settled on Michael's shoulders. If the journal was accurate, the case might contain artwork stolen by the Nazis from Jewish families during the Holocaust, families who had likely been murdered or displaced, their descendants perhaps still searching for their lost heritage. The historical and monetary value could be immense, but more importantly, this represented a profound moral obligation. Returning to the compartment, Michael discovered yet another item he had initially overlooked, a small notebook containing what appeared to be coded information. Lists of names, addresses, and alphanumeric sequences filled its pages, potentially providing the key to identifying the original owners of whatever artwork the case contained. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the shed's interior. Michael knew he needed to make a decision. The responsible course was clear: inform Mrs. Wellington of his discovery and let proper authorities handle the identification and potential restitution of the artwork. Yet a lifetime of experiencing systems that didn't work as they should, particularly for someone in his position, gave him pause. What if this discovery was simply seized by government agencies, the art disappearing into years of bureaucratic limbo? What if the true heirs were never located? What if Mrs. Wellington herself didn't honor her grandfather's apparent intention to return these pieces to their rightful owners? As these thoughts tumbled through his mind, the sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside snapped Michael back to the present moment. Through the dusty window, he could see Mrs. Wellington making her way toward the shed, leaning heavily on her walking cane. In that instant, Michael made his decision. He quickly replaced the floorboards, concealing the compartment, but leaving the journal, photograph, and metal case visible on the workbench. Whatever happened next, he would face it directly and honestly, a value the Army had reinforced, but that had always been central to his character. Mr. Hayes? Mrs. Wellington called as she approached the shed door. "How is the clearing coming along?" Michael opened the door, meeting the elderly woman's gaze with a directness that seemed to surprise her. "Mrs. Wellington, I found something you need to see," he said, stepping aside to reveal his discoveries on the workbench. The elderly woman's expression shifted from polite inquiry to shocked recognition as her eyes fell on the photograph of Samuel Wellington. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards," Michael explained, gesturing toward the recently disturbed section of flooring. "These items were carefully preserved there. I believe they belonged to your father." "Grandfather," she corrected. Automatically, her gaze now fixed on the journal. "Samuel Wellington was my grandfather. My father was just a child during the war." She moved forward with surprising quickness, lifting the photograph with trembling fingers. "I've never seen this picture of him." Michael watched as Mrs. Wellington gently set the photograph down and reached for the journal. "I took the liberty of reading some of it," he admitted. "It appears your grandfather was involved with recovering artwork stolen by the Nazis, and if his writings are accurate, that case may contain valuable paintings he intercepted, artwork he intended to return to the families from whom they were stolen." The elderly woman's expression was unreadable as she carefully opened the journal, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Grandfather never spoke of his war experiences," she said quietly. "He came home changed, according to my grandmother. More solemn, sometimes troubled by nightmares. He became obsessed with news about Holocaust survivors, keeping newspaper clippings and following restitution cases until his death in 1972. She continued, turning pages, stopping occasionally to read passages more carefully. "This explains so much," she murmured, more to herself than to Michael. The mysterious trips to Europe in the 1950s and 60s. The correspondence with international law firms that continued for years after the war. Michael gestured toward the metal case. "We haven't opened that yet." "I didn't want to force the lock." Mrs. Wellington looked up, seeming to truly see Michael for the first time since entering the shed. Her assessment was keen, taking in his worn clothing, the military backpack, the subtle signs of his current circumstances that most people overlooked or chose to ignore. "You found something potentially worth millions of dollars, read enough to understand its significance, and then waited to show me," she observed. "Most people would have disappeared with it immediately." Michael straightened, a hint of the soldier he had been visible in his posture. "That was never an option, ma'am. Whatever's in that case, your grandfather preserved it because he believed in doing the right thing under impossible circumstances. I respect that." A smile, the first genuine one Michael had seen from her, transformed Mrs. Wellington's face, softening the severe lines of age into something almost girlish. "So you do," she agreed. "And I find I trust your judgment, Mr. Hayes. Would you help me carry these items to the house? I believe we have much to discuss, and decisions to make that go far beyond clearing out an old shed." As they carefully gathered the discovered items, Michael felt something shift within him, a sense of purpose that had been absent for too long. Whatever came next, he had found something more valuable than artwork, a chance to be part of something meaningful, a mission worthy of his remaining strengths. The path back to the main house seemed symbolic of the journey ahead, winding, overgrown in places, but ultimately leading toward light and the possibility of restoration, not just for lost artwork, but perhaps for a lost soldier as well. The main house of the Wellington estate stood in stark contrast to the dilapidated garden shed. While the exterior maintained the weathered charm of a classic New England colonial, the interior revealed meticulous preservation, hardwood floors gleaming with generations of polish, walls adorned with carefully maintained family portraits, and furnishings that belonged in a museum of American craftsmanship. Michael felt distinctly out of place as he followed Mrs. Wellington through the foyer, acutely aware of his worn boots leaving faint traces of soil on the immaculate floors. "The study will be most appropriate," Mrs. Wellington announced, leading him down a hallway lined with landscapes in ornate frames. "It has the best light and a table large enough for proper examination." The study proved to be everything one might expect from a room dedicated to serious, intellectual pursuit. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive oak desk positioned to capture natural light from tall windows, and leather chairs that had aged into perfect comfort. Mrs. Wellington directed Michael to place their discoveries on a large table near the windows. "Before we proceed further," she said, settling into one of the chairs with a grace that belied her age, "I believe introductions more substantial than homeless veteran and elderly widow are in order." Her directness was refreshing rather than offensive. Eleanor Wellington, formerly professor of European history at Dartmouth before retirement. "And you, Mr. Hayes, are clearly more than just a man in need of $10. Michael placed the metal case carefully on the table before responding. "Michael Hayes, ma'am. U.S. Army Rangers, honorably discharged 4 years ago after 3 tours in Afghanistan. Before that, a history major who never quite finished his degree at UMass." "A fellow student of history," Eleanor observed with evident approval. "Perhaps that explains your recognition of what these items might represent." She gestured toward the journal. "May I ask what specifically you read that led you to your conclusions?" As Michael recounted the passages detailing Samuel Wellington's moral crisis and eventual decision to intercept the stolen artwork, Eleanor's expression grew increasingly solemn. When he finished, she remained silent for several moments, her fingers lightly tracing the embossed initials on the journal's cover. "My grandfather was a deeply principled man," she finally said. "After the war, he established significant trusts for Holocaust education and survivor support, though he never publicly connected himself to those causes. This explains so much about his later life, the nightmares my grandmother mentioned, his periodic trips to Europe, his obsessive following of restitution cases." She looked up at Michael, her gaze sharp with sudden decision. "We need to open that case, but first." She rose with surprising agility and crossed to the desk, returning with a digital camera. "We should document everything exactly as we found it. This appears to be a custom security system rather than a standard lock. Breaking it would be both destructive and potentially damaging to the contents." Michael studied the mechanism, recognition slowly dawning. "This looks similar to diplomatic pouches I encountered during intelligence briefings in Afghanistan. They use sequential pressure points rather than keys." He pointed to several seemingly decorative elements on the case's exterior. "May I?" At Eleanor's nod, Michael began carefully manipulating the various protrusions and indentations on the case's surface, working through possible combinations. After several minutes of methodical attempts, a faint click rewarded his efforts. "The journal mentioned Samuel was in intelligence," Eleanor murmured. "Of course he would use something like this." With careful hands, Michael lifted the lid of the case. Both he and Eleanor leaned forward, breaths held in anticipation. Inside, wrapped in archival-quality silk and separated by acid-free barriers, lay 6 paintings of modest size, none larger than 20 by 24 inches. Even to Michael's untrained eye, the quality of the artwork was immediately apparent. The colors remained vibrant despite decades in darkness, the brushwork precise and deliberate in a way that spoke of master craftsmanship. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's a Matisse," she whispered, pointing to the topmost painting, a vivid interior scene with a distinctive style, immediately recognizable even to someone with Michael's limited art education. "And beneath it, I believe that's a Monet." With trembling hands, she carefully lifted the Matisse, revealing the painting beneath. "Yes, unmistakably Monet, one of his water lily studies." Her voice faltered. "These are not minor works. Each one could be worth millions." Layer by layer, they revealed the contents of the case. Besides the Matisse and Monet, they discovered what Eleanor identified as works by Renoir, Degas, Pissarro, and Cézanne, a collection of impressionist masterpieces that took her breath away. "The value is incalculable," she murmured, carefully returning the paintings to their protective wrappings. "Not just monetarily, but historically and culturally. These were thought lost for over 75 years. Michael had returned to the journal, searching for specific information about these paintings. "According to your grandfather's notes, these 6 were just part of a larger collection. He intercepted 12 pieces in total. He refers to something called the primary cache and the secondary cache. We found one, but there could be another 6 paintings still hidden somewhere. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Eleanor's eyes widened. "The boathouse," she said suddenly. "Grandfather had it built in 1947, just after returning from the war. It's the only structure on the property that dates from that period that hasn't been significantly renovated or demolished." Night had fallen while they examined the paintings, and Eleanor insisted that further exploration would have to wait until morning. "You'll stay here tonight, Mr. Hayes," she announced in a tone that brooked no argument. "The guest room is always prepared, and we have significant decisions to make about these discoveries." Michael began to protest, uncomfortable with the sudden shift from hired help to house guest, but Eleanor silenced him with a raised hand. "My grandfather preserved these paintings at great personal risk because he believed in doing what was right rather than what was expedient. I believe you understand that principle better than most, Mr. Hayes. Honor me by accepting my hospitality." That night, clean and well-fed for the first time in weeks, Michael lay awake in a bedroom larger than any apartment he'd ever rented. The day's discoveries tumbled through his mind, not just the paintings and their staggering value, but the story they represented. Samuel Wellington had made a moral choice under impossible circumstances, carrying the burden of that decision for the remainder of his life. Morning brought renewed purpose. After a breakfast that reminded Michael of childhood Sunday mornings at his grandmother's table, he and Eleanor made their way to the boathouse, a modest structure perched on the edge of a small private lake on the Wellington property. "Grandfather taught me to sail here," Eleanor reminisced as they approached. "He was a different man on the water lighter somehow, as if the lake washed away whatever troubled him on land." The boathouse appeared well-maintained compared to the garden shed, its weathered cedar siding intact, and the dock extending from its side, still structurally sound. Inside, a small sailboat hung from ceiling hoists, while fishing equipment and water sports gear lined the walls. Where would he hide something here? Michael wondered aloud, surveying the relatively open space. Eleanor moved with purpose toward the back wall. "There's a small workshop through here," she explained, opening a door to reveal a room Michael estimated at about 10 by 12 feet. Workbenches lined 2 walls, while storage cabinets occupied the third. A large wooden map table dominated the center of the space. "This was Grandfather's sanctuary," Eleanor said softly. "No one was allowed in here without his express permission, not even my father. After Grandfather died, it became something of a family museum. Nothing has been removed or rearranged since 1972. Michael studied the room with a soldier's eye for detail. "If I were hiding something valuable, I'd want it close but not obvious." He circled the map table, noting its unusual height and substantial construction. "This seems custom-built," Eleanor nodded. "Grandfather commissioned it specially. He said maps required proper respect and the right height for study without stooping." Kneeling despite his protesting leg, Michael examined the table's underside. Unlike the workbenches with their open construction, the map table had a solid skirt descending from its edges, creating a hidden cavity beneath its surface. Running his hands along this skirt, Michael felt a slight depression similar to the pressure points on the metal case. "I think I've found something," he said, pressing the depression firmly. A soft click rewarded his effort, and a panel in the skirt swung open, revealing a space approximately 6 inches high, extending across the table's entire underside. Inside, secure in custom-fitted recesses, lay another 6 paintings wrapped in protective materials identical to those in the first case. "The secondary cache," Eleanor whispered. Together, they carefully removed the paintings and unwrapped them. On the table's surface, these works appeared different from the first set, darker in subject and tone, with styles Eleanor identified as ranging from Dutch Golden Age to German Expressionism. "A Rembrandt self-portrait," she identified her voice hushed with reverence. "A Klimt landscape. What appears to be a small Vermeer, possibly a study for a larger work." She continued through the collection, identifying works by Kandinsky, Klee, and Franz Marc. The diversity is remarkable. The Nazis weren't discriminating in their theft. Anything of value was targeted, regardless of period or style. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they carefully rewrapped the paintings, Michael returned to examining the hidden compartment. In a small recess at the far end, he discovered another item, a leather portfolio containing documents in German, French, and English. "These appear to be original provenance records," Eleanor said as they examined the papers back in the study. "Certificates of authentication, purchase records, exhibition histories. The Nazis were meticulous about documenting the art they stole. Grandfather must have taken these along with the paintings." The most significant document was a typewritten list in German, translated by hand in the margins into English. It lists these 12 paintings along with their sources, the families or institutions from which they were stolen. Michael leaned closer, studying the names in the margin. Rosenberg, Bernstein, Kleiner, Rothschild, Cohen, Meyerson. All Jewish families? Eleanor nodded grimly. The systematic looting of Jewish-owned art collections was part of the broader Nazi program of cultural genocide. By stripping families of their treasures, they were erasing not just lives but legacies. As they continued examining the documentation, a name on the list suddenly registered with Michael. Rothschild, that's still a prominent family, isn't it? Would finding descendants of these families be possible? More than possible, Eleanor confirmed. Holocaust restitution efforts have created extensive genealogical databases specifically for this purpose. The Rothschilds certainly have well-documented family trees, and many of the other families listed here likely have living descendants who have been searching for these very paintings for generations. The enormity of their discovery was beginning to truly sink in. 12 masterworks stolen during humanity's darkest chapter, preserved by one soldier's moral courage, now rediscovered after 75 years. The potential for healing historical wounds, for providing closure to families who had lost everything, was immeasurable. What's the proper procedure here? Michael asked. Who should be notified first? Eleanor considered this carefully. The ethical and legal considerations are complex. These paintings rightfully belong to the descendants of the original owners. However, simply turning everything over to authorities could result in years of bureaucratic delays and legal battles. She tapped the journal thoughtfully. Grandfather clearly intended these works to be returned to their rightful owners, not surrendered to governments or museums that might have their own agendas. I believe we should honor that intention by being strategic about how we proceed. Over the next several days, Michael and Eleanor developed a careful plan. Using her academic connections, Eleanor arranged a confidential meeting with Dr. Rebecca Stern, a leading expert in Holocaust-era art restitution from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Dr. Stern arrived a week later, her professional demeanor giving way to astonished disbelief as she examined the 12 paintings and their accompanying documentation. "This is unprecedented," she declared, carefully studying the Rembrandt under specialized lighting she had brought. Most recovered Nazi-looted art emerges one piece at a time, often with contested provenance and after decades of legal battles. To find 12 masterworks together, with complete documentation of their theft and a clear chain of custody explaining their absence for 75 years, it's the most significant art recovery since the Monument Men themselves. When Eleanor explained her grandfather's role and his apparent intention to return the works to their rightful owners, Dr. Stern nodded thoughtfully. Samuel Wellington's actions, while technically outside his authority, preserved these paintings when they might otherwise have been lost forever. The moral complexity of his choice is outweighed by the good that can now be done. She outlined the process for proper restitution, the authentication of the works, which she could begin immediately, the verification of provenance, the identification of rightful heirs, and ultimately the return of the paintings to the families from whom they were stolen. "This will take time," she cautioned, "but not nearly as long as if these had emerged without documentation or through the art market. The quality of records your grandfather preserved gives us a clear path forward." While Dr. Stern began the authentication process, Michael immersed himself in Samuel Wellington's journal, piecing together the full story of how these paintings had been saved. The more he read, the deeper his connection grew to the man who had made such a consequential moral choice. Samuel had been assigned to a specialized intelligence unit supporting the Monument Men, the Allied officers tasked with protecting cultural treasures and recovering stolen art during World War II. His official role involved documenting Nazi art theft for eventual prosecution and restitution. However, as the war neared its end, he discovered that certain high-value collections were being diverted by corrupt officials on both sides of the conflict. The 12 paintings they had found had been part of a larger shipment destined for Hermann Göring's private collection. When Allied bombing disrupted the transport, creating confusion about exactly which works had been destroyed, Samuel seized the opportunity to secure these 12 masterpieces with the explicit intention of protecting them until they could be properly returned. He carried this secret for the rest of his life, Eleanor reflected as Michael shared these details. The journal entries from after the war show he made multiple attempts to locate surviving family members, but the chaos of post-war Europe made it nearly impossible. Many of these families were entirely wiped out in the Holocaust, their records destroyed, their lineages seemingly ended. Michael nodded, understanding the weight of such a burden. He chose to become the guardian of these paintings rather than surrender them to a system he didn't trust to complete their journey home. 3 weeks after their initial discovery, Dr. Stern returned with confirmed authentications of all 12 paintings and preliminary findings on potential heirs. 7 of the original families had definitive living descendants. 3 had possible distant relatives requiring further genealogical research, and 2 appeared to have no surviving family members. The combined value of these works exceeds $400 million at current market rates, Dr. Stern informed them. But their historical and cultural significance transcends monetary assessment. These aren't just valuable paintings, they're physical connections to families who lost everything. Eleanor had been contemplating their path forward throughout this process. Now, with authentication complete and heir identification underway, she made a decision that surprised both Michael and Dr. Stern. "I want to establish a foundation," she announced. "The Samuel Wellington Holocaust Art Restitution Trust. Its mission will be threefold. First, to ensure these 12 paintings are returned to their rightful heirs without legal entanglements or costs to the families. Second, to create traveling exhibitions of these works before their return, educating the public about Nazi art theft and the ongoing importance of restitution. And third, to establish a permanent research center dedicated to locating and returning other lost artworks." Dr. Stern's expression reflected both surprise and approval. "That's remarkably generous," Mrs. Wellington, such a foundation would normally require substantial funding beyond the considerable costs of proper restitution. Eleanor smiled, her decision evidently made well before this conversation. I've lived comfortably for many years on family wealth that now seems insignificant compared to the moral wealth my grandfather preserved. The Wellington estate and my personal investments will provide the necessary funding to establish this foundation properly. She turned to Michael, who had been quietly listening. And I would like you, Mr. Hayes, to serve as the foundation's first director. Your background in history, your military experience, and most importantly, your moral compass make you uniquely qualified to carry forward my grandfather's legacy. Michael stared at her in disbelief. Mrs. Wellington, I've been homeless for 8 months. I have no administrative experience, no connections in the art world. No, you have integrity, Eleanor interrupted firmly. You have perspective that can't be taught in any university. And you recognize the significance of these paintings, not just as valuable objects, but as pieces of human history that deserve respect and proper handling. Her expression softened. Besides, my grandfather took a chance on preserving something precious when conventional wisdom would have called it impossible. I'm merely following his example. Dr. Stern, watching this exchange with evident interest, added her own assessment. For what it's worth, Mr. Hayes, the restitution community could benefit greatly from someone with your background. Too often, these processes become academic exercises divorced from their human impact. Your military service and your own experiences with loss and displacement might bring valuable perspective. As the implications of Eleanor's offer began to sink in, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of genuine hope, not just for himself, but for his ability to contribute meaningfully to the world again. The journey from cleaning a garden shed for $10 to potentially directing a multi-million-dollar foundation dedicated to historical justice seemed impossible. Yet here it was offered not as charity, but as recognition of his inherent worth. I would be honored, he said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. But I'll need guidance, mentorship. This isn't a responsibility to be taken lightly. Eleanor's smile deepened with approval. Precisely the response I expected from you. We'll build the necessary support structure to gather legal advisors, art historians, Holocaust researchers. You won't be alone in this mission. As they began discussing the practical details of establishing the foundation, Michael found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. Samuel Wellington had made a moral choice in 1945 that rippled across decades, ultimately creating an opportunity for redemption and purpose that Michael could never have imagined when he accepted a simple $10 job. Some treasures, it seemed, were hidden not just to preserve their monetary value, but to await the right moment and the right people to fulfill their true purpose. In saving these paintings, Samuel Wellington had perhaps also saved Michael Hayes, giving him not just employment, but a mission worthy of the second chance he had been searching for since leaving the battlefield. 6 months after the discovery in the garden shed, Michael stood in the elegant gallery of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, watching as visitors moved reverently between the displayed paintings. The exhibition, Reclaimed Legacy, the Samuel Wellington collection of Holocaust-looted art, had opened to international acclaim and unprecedented attendance. Each masterwork was displayed alongside photographs and histories of the families from whom they had been stolen, transforming what could have been merely an art exhibition into a powerful testament to both historical injustice and long-delayed restoration. Quite a change from cleaning out garden sheds, isn't it? Eleanor Wellington remarked, joining Michael as he observed a young couple studying the mattice. At 86, Eleanor remained remarkably spry, though she now occasionally used the elegant ebony cane that had once belonged to her grandfather. Every day feels surreal, Michael admitted. The transformation of his life had been so rapid and complete that he sometimes woke expecting to find himself back on a shelter cot. Instead, he now occupied the carriage house on the Wellington estate, converted into a comfortable living space and office from which he directed the foundation's growing operations. "The Cohen family representatives arrive tomorrow," he reminded Eleanor. "The Rembrandt will be the first painting officially restituted." Eleanor nodded, her expression solemn yet satisfied. "Sarah Cohen is the great-granddaughter of the original owners. Her grandfather was just a child when the painting was taken. He survived Auschwitz and spent decades searching for his family's lost collection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The restitution ceremony the following day was intimate but profound. Sarah Cohen, a dignified woman in her 60s, accepted the Rembrandt self-portrait with hands that trembled slightly as they touched the frame. Her grandfather, she explained, had described this painting from memory until his dying day. The way the light caught Rembrandt's eyes, the particular shade of the background, the subtle brushwork in the collar. For 3 generations, this painting existed only in stories, she told the small gathering of foundation staff, museum representatives, and selected media. Now it exists again in reality. But more important than the painting itself is what this restitution represents: the acknowledgement that what was taken unjustly must be returned, even across decades. Time does not diminish this obligation. When she insisted on personally thanking Michael, he felt undeserving of her gratitude. "I just found the paintings," he demurred. "Samuel Wellington is the one who saved them." Sarah Cohen studied him with perceptive eyes. "Everyone involved in this journey made choices, Mr. Hayes. You could have ignored what you found or sought to profit from it. Instead, you chose to honor both the paintings and the people from whom they were stolen." She gestured toward the Rembrandt, now carefully crated for transport to her home. "My grandfather used to say that we are all links in a chain of moral action. Samuel Wellington forged the first link, but you and Mrs. Wellington completed the chain." This perspective, that he was part of something larger than himself, helped Michael navigate the overwhelming transition from homeless veteran to foundation director. The skills that had served him as a ranger: strategic thinking, attention to detail, commitment to mission completion, proved surprisingly transferable to his new role. Where he lacked specific knowledge about art history or nonprofit management, he demonstrated a remarkable ability to identify and recruit experts who shared the foundation's mission. Dr. Rebecca Stern became the foundation's chief art historian, bringing credibility and expertise to their restitution efforts. James Littman, a prominent Holocaust researcher, joined as director of genealogical research, leading the complex process of identifying and verifying heirs. Eleanor herself served as board chairwoman, her academic background and family connection to Samuel providing both governance and continuity. The foundation's work expanded beyond the original 12 paintings as other families with lost artwork sought their assistance. Michael established a systematic approach to these cases, applying military precision to the chaotic field of art. Restitution. Each case was thoroughly documented, researched, and pursued with the same dedication as the Wellington collection itself. "You've created something remarkable here," Eleanor observed one evening, 6 months after the first restitution. They were reviewing applications for the Foundation's newly established research grants, designed to support emerging scholars in Holocaust studies and art restitution. "Samuel would be proud, not just of what you've accomplished, but how you've accomplished it." Michael looked up from the grant proposals spread across his desk. "What do you mean?" "You've approached this work with respect for both the art and the people connected to it," Eleanor explained. "Some in the restitution field become so focused on the objects that they forget the human stories behind them. Others become so caught up in the emotional narratives that they neglect the scholarly rigor necessary for successful restitution. You've maintained balance between these extremes." This observation resonated with Michael. During his military service, he had witnessed how easily mission objectives could overshadow human impact, how procedures could become more important than purpose. In establishing the Foundation's methodology, he had consciously sought to keep the human element central while maintaining the discipline necessary for effective operation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Foundation's reputation grew steadily, attracting international attention and partnership. Opportunities with major museums and Holocaust remembrance organizations. When the U.S. State Department established a special committee on Nazi-looted art in October, Michael was invited to serve as a consultant, a remarkable acknowledgement of his unexpected expertise. Yet amid this professional success, Michael struggled with aspects of his personal adjustment. The nightmares that had plagued him since Afghanistan hadn't disappeared, though they had evolved. Now they often featured searching for something precious that remained just beyond reach, waking him with a sense of unfulfilled responsibility rather than the terror of his earlier combat-related dreams. The Foundation's work also stirred complex emotions about his own family history. Michael had lost contact with his parents and siblings years ago, their relationship strained by his post-deployment struggles and his inability to reintegrate into civilian life. As he helped reconnect families with their lost legacies, the absence of his own family connections became increasingly painful. Eleanor, with her historian's perspective and personal experience of loss, recognized these struggles without Michael having to articulate them. One morning, after noticing Michael's distraction during their weekly planning meeting, she invited him to walk with her along the property's perimeter path, a ritual that had become their venue for the most important conversations. When Samuel returned from the war, my grandmother told me he would sometimes disappear for hours, walking the boundaries of this property, Eleanor said as they followed the winding trail through autumn-tinged woods. She worried at first, but eventually understood he was reconnecting himself to something stable after years of chaos. Michael nodded, understanding the impulse. In Afghanistan, we measured safety in perimeters. Knowing your boundaries meant knowing where control ended and danger began. And now? What boundaries are you struggling with, Michael? The directness of her question caught him off guard, though it shouldn't have. Eleanor had never been one for polite evasions. I'm helping reunite families with their lost histories while my own family remains estranged, he admitted after a moment. It feels hypocritical somehow. Eleanor considered this as they continued walking. Perhaps it's not hypocrisy but preparation, she suggested. You're learning the value of historical connection and reconciliation through others' experiences. This may be preparing you for your own eventual reconciliation. This perspective had never occurred to Michael. You think I should contact my family? I think healing often requires closing circles, whether they're historical or personal, Eleanor replied. The paintings we've returned have closed circles that remained open for generations. Perhaps it's time to consider what circles in your own life need closing. This conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks as Michael found himself thinking increasingly about his family. His younger sister Jamie's birthday approached. She would be turning 30, he realized with a start. The milestone provided a natural opportunity for contact, but uncertainty about how to bridge the years of silence held him back. The decision was ultimately prompted by an unexpected parallel. The Foundation had been working on a particularly complex case involving a Gustav Klimt landscape stolen from the Bernstein family in Vienna. After months of research, they had located the sole surviving descendant, a man who had changed his name and deliberately distanced himself from his family history, traumatized by the stories of loss that had shadowed his childhood. When Michael finally spoke with him, explaining the painting they had found, the man's initial reaction was rejection. That part of my life is over, he had said firmly. I have no interest in reopening old wounds. Respecting this decision, Michael had nevertheless sent him the complete documentation. They had assembled photographs of the painting, family histories, the provenance research. "Whatever you decide about the painting itself," Michael had written, "this history belongs to you. Some doors can remain closed while still acknowledging they exist." 2 weeks later, the man had called back, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been running from ghosts," he admitted. "But seeing my grandmother's face in those photographs you sent, it made her real in a way family stories never could. I'd like to reclaim the painting after all, not for its value, but because it's the only physical connection to her that remains." This experience crystallized something for Michael. His own family estrangement had begun as a form of self-protection during his darkest post-deployment period. Like the Bernstein descendant, he had closed a door on painful connections. But perhaps, also like him, there was value in reopening that door on new terms. On his sister's birthday, Michael sent a carefully chosen card with a brief note explaining his current work and expressing hope that she was well. He included his contact information without expectation or pressure, simply opening a channel that had been closed for years. Jamie's response came 3 days later, a text message with a photo of her holding the card. Her smile tentative but genuine. "Mom cried when I showed her this," she had written. "We've missed you, Mikey. Call when you're ready." Their first conversation was awkward, years of absence creating gaps that small talk couldn't easily bridge. But beneath the discomfort lay a foundation of shared history that remained intact despite the silence. Jamie was married now, mother to a 4-year-old boy named after their grandfather. Their parents had retired to a small coastal town in North Carolina. Their brother Ryan had followed Michael into the military, serving as a medic in the Navy. "He always looked up to you," Jamie said, her voice softening. "Even when you were at your worst, when you pushed everyone away, he defended you." Sighed. "We couldn't understand what you'd been through." This revelation struck Michael deeply. He had assumed his family's distance reflected disappointment or judgment of his failures. The possibility that they had simply been respecting boundaries he himself had established had never occurred to him. Over the following months, as the foundation's work continued to flourish, Michael gradually rebuilt connections with his family. The process wasn't without setbacks, old patterns, and unresolved tensions occasionally surfaced, but the skills he had developed in art restitution proved unexpectedly applicable to personal reconciliation. Patience, thorough documentation, willingness to confront difficult truths, and respect for complex emotions were as valuable in healing family wounds as in returning stolen paintings. By the 1-year anniversary of the garden shed discovery, 9 of the 12 Wellington collection paintings had been successfully restituted to descendants of their original owners. The remaining 3, belonging to families with no identified living heirs, remained in the foundation's care while the search for distant relatives continued. To mark this milestone, the foundation hosted a symposium on Holocaust art restitution at Harvard University, bringing together scholars, survivors' families, museum directors, and legal experts from around the world. Michael, once uncomfortable with public speaking, delivered the keynote address with quiet confidence, his military bearing now softened by the compassion his work had cultivated. "Art restitution is not merely about returning objects to their rightful owners," he told the assembled audience. "It's about restoring connections severed by history's darkest chapter. Each painting we return represents not just pigment on canvas, but a family's heritage made tangible again. In this work, we confront uncomfortable truths about human capacity for both cruelty and courage." He shared Samuel Wellington's story, honoring the moral choice that had preserved these masterworks when they might otherwise have been lost forever. Samuel Wellington understood that sometimes doing the right thing requires working outside established systems. He carried the burden of these paintings for decades, hoping they would eventually complete their journey home. What Michael didn't Share publicly was how profoundly Samuel's example had reshaped his own understanding of purpose and redemption. Like the paintings hidden beneath floorboards and inside table cavities, Michael had spent years concealing his own potential, buried beneath trauma and disconnection. The discovery in the garden shed had unearthed not just art treasures, but the possibility of a life rebuilt around meaning rather than mere survival. Following the symposium, the foundation received a significant grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to expand its research capabilities. This funding allowed Michael to establish a dedicated team, focused solely on identifying heirs for artworks with incomplete provenance records, not just from the Wellington collection, but from the estimated 100,000 Nazi-looted paintings still unrecovered worldwide. Eleanor, observing the foundation's growth with evident satisfaction, began gradually transferring more operational responsibility to Michael. Her health remained remarkably good for her age, but the wisdom that had guided her through a distinguished academic career now told her that succession planning was essential for the foundation's long-term impact. Samuel preserved these paintings knowing he might not live to see them returned. She told Michael during one of their perimeter walks, "I've established this foundation knowing I might not live to see its full potential realized. This is how legacy works. We plant trees whose shade we may never sit under." As winter yielded to spring, Michael received unexpected news from his brother Ryan, now stationed at Walter Reed Medical Center. A fellow veteran undergoing treatment there had recognized Michael from a television interview about the foundation's work. "Says he served with you in Kandahar," Ryan reported. "Thomas Mercer? Claims you saved his life during an ambush outside the wire." The name immediately transported Michael back to the worst day of his final deployment, a routine patrol that had turned into an 8-hour firefight. Mercer had been a young specialist, barely 21, when shrapnel from an IED had severed his femoral artery. Michael had applied a tourniquet and carried him 2 kilometers under sporadic fire to reach extraction. "He's having a rough time," Ryan continued. "Multiple surgeries, PTSD, the works. But he perked up talking about you. Says seeing what you're doing now gives him hope he might find purpose again someday." This connection between his military past and present work affected Michael deeply. He had compartmentalized these chapters of his life, viewing his time as a ranger as separate from, perhaps even in opposition to, his current role. The idea that his military service and foundation work might represent continuity rather than contrast was revelatory. The following weekend, Michael visited Walter Reed, reuniting with Mercer for the first time since Afghanistan. The young man's physical injuries had healed, but the psychological wounds remained evident in his watchful eyes and tension-held shoulders, bearing Michael recognized from his own darkest post-deployment days. Their conversation began awkwardly, but gradually found rhythm as they shared experiences of both combat and civilian reintegration. When Mercer expressed interest in the foundation's work, Michael found himself describing not just the art restitution process, but the deeper purpose it served. "It's about recognizing that objects carry meaning beyond their material value," he explained. "These paintings aren't just valuable because they're masterworks. They matter because they're physical connections to families who lost everything tangible. Links to histories that might otherwise exist only in memory or documentation." Mercer nodded slowly. "That makes sense to me. When I got home, I couldn't explain to my family why my grandfather's hunting knife meant so much, why I carried it through 3 deployments, even though it wasn't practical for anything we actually did over there. It wasn't about the knife itself. It was about having something that connected me to something stable when everything else kept changing." This insight, the profound human need for tangible connections to personal and cultural history, had emerged repeatedly in Michael's work with Holocaust survivors' families. Now he recognized how it applied equally to veterans struggling to bridge the divide between military service and civilian life. As their meeting concluded, Michael found himself offering Mercer an opportunity that hadn't existed until that moment. An internship with the foundation, focusing on education and outreach to military communities. "Your perspective would be valuable," he said. "And maybe, like me, you'll find that skills you developed in the military have applications you never imagined." The genuine hope that flickered across Mercer's face reminded Michael of his own first days working with Eleanor, the tentative. Recognition that purpose might still be possible after so much had been lost. In offering this opportunity, Michael realized he was completing another circle, extending to Mercer the same chance at renewal that Eleanor had offered him. On the drive back to Boston, Michael reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed his life. A desperate acceptance of a $10 job had led to the discovery of paintings worth millions, which in turn had created a foundation now helping families around the world reconnect with their lost heritage. His own family relationships were healing, and he had found unexpected purpose in work that honored both history and human dignity. Samuel Wellington's moral courage during World War II had set in motion ripples that continued to spread decades after his death. The paintings he had hidden represented not just artistic masterworks, but the potential for healing that exists when people choose justice over expediency, restoration over abandonment. As Michael approached the Wellington estate, now home to both his residence and the Foundation's headquarters, the setting sun illuminated the property with golden light reminiscent of the Klimt landscape they had recently restituted. The beauty of the moment struck him forcefully, not just the physical landscape, but the philosophical one he now inhabited, where meaning and purpose had replaced the isolation and despair of his homeless months. Some treasures, he reflected, remain hidden until exactly the right moment, preserved not by accident, but by design, waiting for the convergence of circumstances and individuals capable of understanding their true value. Like the paintings Samuel Wellington had concealed beneath floorboards and inside furniture, the potential for renewal often exists in unexpected places, requiring only the courage to look beneath surfaces and the patience to complete journeys that may span generations. The garden shed where it had all begun was gone now, demolished as planned to make way for a memorial garden dedicated to Holocaust survivors. Yet its legacy continued in ways neither Michael nor Eleanor could have imagined on that autumn day, when a homeless veteran had reluctantly accepted a $10 cleaning job, not knowing that what he would uncover would not only change his life, but help heal historical wounds that had remained open for over 75 years. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Michael felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the second chance he had been given, but for the opportunity to extend that same chance to others through work that honored both the past and the possibility of restoration. In the end, this was perhaps the most valuable discovery of all, that even the darkest chapters of history and the most challenging personal circumstances contain within them the seeds of redemption, waiting only for the right moment and the right hands to nurture them into being. 5 years after that fateful day in the garden shed, Michael stood in the gleaming new headquarters of the Samuel Wellington Holocaust Art Restitution Trust in downtown Boston. What had begun as a small foundation operating from the Wellington estate had evolved into an internationally recognized organization with 27 full-time staff members and satellite offices in New York, London, and Berlin. The modern glass building, with its carefully designed exhibition spaces and research facilities, represented a dramatic departure from the dilapidated shed where Michael had first stumbled upon the hidden artwork. Yet the mission remained fundamentally the same, reuniting families with pieces of their history that had been violently taken from them. "They're ready for you in the conference room," announced Sophia Bernstein, the Foundation's communications director. Once the reluctant heir to the Klimt landscape, she had eventually joined the Foundation's team, bringing both personal experience and professional expertise to their public outreach efforts. The Meyerson family just arrived from Israel. Michael nodded, straightening his tie before following Sophia down the corridor. These restitution ceremonies, now conducted monthly as the foundation's work expanded well beyond the original 12 paintings, never failed to move him deeply. Each represented not just the return of valuable artwork, but the restoration of connections severed by history's cruelty. The Meyerson case had been particularly challenging. The painting, a small but exquisite Cézanne still life, had been among the last 3 works from the Wellington collection awaiting restitution. After years of exhaustive genealogical research had failed to identify living descendants, the foundation had nearly classified it as heirless. Then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. DNA testing submitted to a genealogy website by a young Israeli engineer had created a match with historical samples the foundation had obtained from the original Meyerson family's possessions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the conference room, Michael was struck by how young the Meyerson descendants were, the oldest perhaps in his 30s, accompanied by several siblings in their 20s. Unlike many restitution ceremonies involving elderly survivors or their children, this represented a new generation encountering their family's history for the first time. "Welcome to Boston," Michael greeted them, extending his hand to David Meyerson, the family's unofficial spokesperson. "We're honored to finally meet you after so many months of correspondence." "The honor is ours," David replied, his accented English precise. "What your foundation has accomplished is nothing short of miraculous. Until your contact, we knew almost nothing about our family before Israel." This was increasingly common. Michael had found younger generations whose grandparents or great-grandparents had deliberately severed connections with their European past, seeking to build new identities unburdened by trauma. The paintings often served as bridges to histories that had been intentionally forgotten, sometimes reopening wounds, but also providing context and closure that had been absent for decades. The ceremony proceeded with the careful dignity that had become the foundation's hallmark. Dr. Rebecca Stern, now the foundation's senior art historian, presented the provenance research documenting the painting's history from its creation in Cézanne's studio to its acquisition by the Meyerson family in 1920, its theft by Nazi forces in 1941, and finally its preservation by Samuel Wellington and subsequent rediscovery. When the painting itself was unveiled, a vibrant arrangement of fruit and pottery that somehow captured both tranquility and tension in Cézanne's distinctive style, the Meyerson siblings fell silent, their expressions reflecting the complex mixture of emotions. They were seeing something that connected them to ancestors they had never known, to a family history that had been deliberately obscured by survival's necessities. "Our grandfather never spoke of Europe," David explained during the reception that followed. "He arrived in Palestine in 1946, just 17 years old and completely alone. He built a new life from nothing, becoming an engineer and helping develop irrigation systems in the early days of Israel. The past was something he refused to discuss." Michael nodded, understanding the protective silence many survivors had maintained. That's not uncommon. For many, moving forward meant not looking back. "When we were children, he would become very still whenever the Holocaust was mentioned on television," David continued. "But he never shared his experiences. After his death last year, we found a small metal box containing just 3 items. Pocket watch, a faded photograph of people we didn't recognize, and a small card with a painting on it. The same painting you've just returned to us." He produced his phone, showing Michael a photograph of the card, a pre-war gallery exhibition announcement featuring a small reproduction of the Cézanne. "He carried this his entire life, never telling us what it meant. Now we understand it was the last connection to his family's legacy before everything was stolen." Such stories had become familiar to Michael over the years, each unique yet sharing common threads of loss, silence, and the persistent human need for connection to the past. The paintings served as physical anchors to histories that might otherwise exist only in memory, or documentation, tangible proof that what had been taken could, in some small measure, be restored. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the reception concluded and the Meyerson family prepared to return to their hotel with the carefully packed painting, David approached Michael privately. "There's something else," he said, his voice lower. "My grandfather's box contained one more item I didn't mention earlier, a key. We never knew what it opened, but there's an engraving that matches information in your foundation's research about our family's pre-war address in Vienna." He handed Michael a small brass key with a distinctive pattern and numbered tag. "Perhaps it's nothing, but if your researchers are still working on documenting Holocaust-era property claims, this unexpected development, seemingly minor yet potentially significant, exemplified how the Foundation's work continued to evolve in ways Michael could never have anticipated. What had begun as the restitution of 12 specific paintings had expanded into a comprehensive approach to Holocaust-era property restitution, encompassing not just art but real estate, insurance policies, bank accounts, and cultural artifacts of all kinds. "We'll look into this immediately," Michael assured him, carefully securing the key. "Even if it leads nowhere specific, it's another piece of your family's history worth documenting." After the Meyersons departed, Michael found himself drawn to the Foundation's memorial garden, a quiet space designed for reflection that occupied the top floor of their building. Modeled after the garden that had replaced the Wellington shed, it featured plants indigenous to the countries from which the looted artwork had originated, creating a living testament to the diverse cultures that had been targeted for destruction. Eleanor Wellington had insisted on this feature when they designed the headquarters, understanding that their work required not just efficient office space, but places for contemplation and remembrance. Though Eleanor herself had passed away too, years earlier at the age of 89, her influence remained evident throughout the Foundation, from its philosophical approach to its architectural choices. Sitting on a bench beneath a small flowering cherry tree, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The homeless veteran who had grudgingly accepted a $10 cleaning job now directed an organization with assets exceeding $80 million, partnerships with major museums and governmental agencies, and a staff that included some of the world's leading experts in Holocaust-era restitution. The transformation seemed impossible, yet it had unfolded one step at a time, each decision building upon the last, each success creating opportunities for further growth. What had begun as the simple return of stolen paintings had expanded into a mission that encompassed education, research, advocacy, and eventually the development of international legal frameworks for cultural property restitution. Thomas Mercer approached, interrupting Michael's reflections. Once a wounded veteran struggling with PTSD, Mercer had flourished during his internship with the Foundation and now served as director of their Veterans Integration Program, an initiative that trained former military personnel for careers in art security, provenance research, and restitution logistics. "Sorry to disturb you," Mercer said, recognizing Michael's contemplative mood. "But the team in Berlin just reported a breakthrough on the Frankenstein collection. They've authenticated 3 additional paintings that match Samuel Wellington's documentation." This news, the potential expansion of their work beyond the original 12 paintings, was significant. Samuel Wellington's journal had mentioned other looted collections he had documented, but been unable to intercept, providing details that the Foundation's researchers had been quietly investigating for years. Where were they found? Michael asked, immediately engaged. "A small private collection in Argentina," Mercer reported. "The current owner claims to have purchased them legitimately in the 1980s, but our provenance research clearly traces them to the Nazi Looting of the Frankenstein Gallery in 1938. The owner is willing to negotiate their return rather than face potential legal action. This pattern had become increasingly common as the foundation's reputation grew. Their approach prioritizing restitution over punishment, offering fair compensation to good faith purchasers of looted art, and emphasizing education rather than public shaming had created an environment where previously reluctant collectors often came forward voluntarily. Set up a call with the Berlin team, Michael instructed, and contact the Frankenstein descendants in Montreal. They should be involved from the beginning. As Mercer departed to make the arrangements, Michael's phone chimed with a message from his sister Jamie. The photograph showed his nephew, now 9 years old and bearing a striking resemblance to Michael at that age, proudly holding the school history project about the Holocaust. The accompanying text read, "Sam chose this topic because of Uncle Mike's important work. You're his hero." This simple message, more than the Foundation's international recognition or the millions of dollars in art they had successfully restituted, represented the personal transformation that mattered most to Michael. The estranged brother who had once been too damaged to maintain family connections was now not only reconnected, but serving as a positive influence for the next generation. His relationship with his family had been fully restored over the years, with regular visits and holiday gatherings replacing the years of silence. His parents had even relocated to Boston after his father's health issues required specialized care, allowing Michael to provide support that would have been impossible during his homeless period. As the afternoon light filtered through the cherry blossoms above him, Michael found himself thinking about Samuel Wellington, the man whose moral courage had set this entire journey in motion. Like many veterans, Wellington had returned from war carrying both visible and invisible wounds. Yet he had channeled his trauma into purposeful action, making a choice that reverberated across decades. In preserving those paintings at great personal risk, Wellington hadn't just saved valuable artwork. He had created a bridge across time, connecting families to their lost heritage, providing closure to wounds that had remained open for generations, and ultimately offering redemption to a homeless veteran who might otherwise have remained lost himself. The parallels between their experiences had not been lost on Michael. Both had witnessed humanity at its worst. Both had struggled with the after effects of combat, and both had ultimately found purpose in restoration rather than destruction. The difference was that Wellington had carried his burden alone, while Michael had been blessed with a community of support, beginning with Eleanor Wellington's recognition of his inherent worth beneath the circumstances of homelessness. This reflection was interrupted by Sophia's return. "The State Department is on line 1, she informed him. "They want to discuss the new international protocols for cultural property restitution. And the director of the Holocaust Museum called about your keynote address for next month's symposium." Michael nodded, rising from the bench. The contemplative moment had passed, replaced by the practical demands of the Foundation's expanding work. Yet as he followed Sophia back toward his office, he carried with him a renewed appreciation for the connection between past and present, between individual choices and their collective impact. That evening, after the day's meetings had concluded and most staff had departed, Michael found himself drawn to the Foundation's central exhibition space, a carefully designed gallery where selected pieces from restituted collections were temporarily displayed before being returned to their rightful owners. The current exhibition focused on art as resistance, featuring works created by Jewish artists during the Nazi period, often under impossible conditions. As he moved slowly through the gallery, studying pieces created in ghettos and concentration camps, Michael was struck anew by the human capacity for meaning-making, even in darkness. These artists facing starvation, persecution, and imminent death had nevertheless created works of beauty and significance, bearing witness through their art when all other forms of testimony were denied them. A small sketch particularly caught his attention: a simple drawing of a child's face, created on scavenged paper with a smuggled pencil in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. The artist had died in Auschwitz, but this fragment of their work had survived, eventually, making its way to the foundation through a complex chain of providence. The drawing's power lay not in technical mastery, but in its essential humanity, the refusal to surrender dignity and creative expression, even under the most dehumanizing circumstances. It embodied the principle that had increasingly guided the foundation's work, the recognition that restitution wasn't merely about returning valuable objects, but about restoring the human connections and cultural continuity that genocide had sought to destroy. Michael's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Rabbi David Goldstein, who served as the Foundation's ethical advisor. In his late 70s, Goldstein brought both scholarly expertise and personal experience to their work. His own parents had survived Auschwitz, their family possessions confiscated and never recovered. "I thought I might find you here," the rabbi said, joining Michael before the displayed artwork. "The Meyerson ceremony went well today." "It did," Michael agreed. "Though I'm always struck by how complex these reunions can be, joy mixed with grief, closure accompanied by new questions." Rabbi Goldstein nodded thoughtfully. "In Jewish tradition, there's a concept called tikkun olam, the repair of the world. It suggests that human actions can either further fragment a broken world or help restore it toward wholeness." He gestured toward the exhibited artworks. "What your foundation does goes beyond legal restitution. You're engaging in tikkun olam, healing breaches that have remained open for generations." This perspective resonated deeply with Michael. The Foundation's work wasn't merely about transferring ownership of valuable objects. It was about acknowledging wounds, restoring connections, and ultimately contributing to a more just world where historical injustices were addressed rather than ignored. "When I was homeless," Michael found himself sharing, "one of the most painful aspects wasn't the physical discomfort, but the sense of being disconnected from family, from purpose, from any meaningful future. In some small way, that gives me insight into what Holocaust survivors experienced, albeit on an incomparably different scale." "Loss of connection is at the heart of trauma," Rabbi Goldstein agreed, "which is why restoration of connection is essential to healing. The paintings you return aren't valuable only for their monetary worth or artistic significance. They're connections to a world that was systematically destroyed, tangible links to people, communities, and cultural identities that might otherwise exist only in fading memory." As they continued their conversation, moving slowly through the exhibition, Michael found himself sharing something he rarely discussed: the recurring dream that had replaced his combat nightmares in recent years. In this dream, he was carefully reassembling a shattered object of great beauty, piecing together fragments that somehow remained luminous despite their brokenness. "I used to think it was about the artwork," he admitted. "But lately I've wondered if it's about something larger, the idea that restoration is possible even after devastating fragmentation." Rabbi Goldstein smiled gently. "Perhaps it's both. In the Kabbalistic tradition, there's a beautiful concept that when God created the world, divine light was poured into vessels that couldn't contain its power. The vessels shattered, scattering divine sparks throughout creation. Our sacred task as humans is to gather these sparks, to participate in the restoration of what was broken." This mystical framework offered Michael a new perspective on the Foundation's practical work. Each painting returned, each family connection restored, each historical truth acknowledged, represented a small gathering of scattered light, a contribution to restoration that transcended the specific objects involved. The following morning brought a development that would test this philosophical framework in unexpected ways. The Foundation's legal team had been contacted by representatives of the German government regarding a complex case involving the final painting from the original Wellington collection, a small Franz Marc landscape that had defied all attempts to identify living heirs. After years of exhaustive research, they had confirmed that the original owners, the Kleiner family of Dresden, had been entirely wiped out during the Holocaust, with no surviving descendants. Under normal circumstances, such heirless artwork would be designated for display in public museums with appropriate acknowledgement of its provenance and the circumstances of its theft. The complication arose from recently discovered documentation suggesting that before the Nazi confiscation, the Kleiners had been in negotiations to sell the painting to fund family members' emigration to Shanghai. The potential buyer had been a Jewish art dealer who himself subsequently perished in the Holocaust, but whose grandchildren now claimed rights to the painting based on this incomplete transaction. "It's unprecedented," explained Sarah Cohen, who had joined the Foundation's legal team after the restitution of her family's Rembrandt. "We have competing moral claims with substantial legitimacy on both sides, but incomplete documentation and no direct heirs from the original owners." This case epitomized the evolving complexity of the Foundation's work. What had begun as the relatively straightforward return of artwork to identifiable heirs had expanded to include increasingly nuanced scenarios involving competing claims, partial documentation, and fundamental questions about the nature of justice when direct restoration was impossible. After extensive consultation with their ethics committee, legal advisors, and Holocaust survivor organizations, Michael proposed an innovative solution: the establishment of a joint stewardship arrangement between the Foundation and the German Cultural Ministry. The Franz Marc landscape would be permanently displayed in a German public museum with comprehensive documentation of its history, while proceeds from a dedicated endowment would support both Holocaust education and ongoing efforts to identify and assist survivors and their descendants. This resolution, emphasizing commemoration, education, and ongoing commitment to justice rather than conventional ownership, represented a new paradigm in restitution practice. Rather than treating the painting merely as property to be allocated, it acknowledged the artwork's role as both historical witness and contemporary teacher. When the arrangement was finalized and announced, it received international recognition as a model for addressing similarly complex cases. What might have become a contentious legal battle instead became an opportunity for collaborative healing and public education. For Michael personally, this resolution brought a sense of completion to the journey that had begun in the Wellington garden shed. All 12 paintings from Samuel Wellington's hidden collection had now found their proper destinations. Most returned directly to descendants of the original owners, and the final piece dedicated to broader historical remembrance and education. On the 5th anniversary of the Foundation's establishment, Michael found himself back at the Wellington estate, now serving as the organization's educational center and retreat facility. Standing in the memorial garden that had replaced the demolished shed, he watched as a group of high school students engaged with interactive exhibits about Holocaust history and the ongoing importance of restitution efforts. Among them was his nephew Sam, visiting with his school group from North Carolina. Watching the boys' earnest engagement with this difficult history, Michael felt a profound sense of continuity, not just the personal connection across generations of his own family, but the broader continuity of memory and moral responsibility that the Foundation's work represented. Later, as evening approached and the students departed, Michael walked the perimeter path that he and Eleanor had often traveled during their most important conversations. Though she had been gone for 2 years, he still found himself mentally consulting her wisdom when facing particularly challenging decisions. The path led eventually to the boathouse where they had discovered the second cache of paintings. Now restored to its original purpose, it housed a small sailboat that Michael occasionally took onto the lake during retreats and planning sessions. Samuel Wellington had apparently found peace on these waters following his wartime experiences, and Michael had discovered a similar tranquility there during his own journey of healing. As he stood on the dock watching the sunset reflect across the lake's surface, Michael reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed his life. A desperate acceptance of a $10 job had ultimately led to the creation of an organization that had returned hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen artwork to Holocaust survivors and their descendants, established international protocols for cultural property restitution, and provided meaningful employment to dozens of people, including many veterans who, like Michael himself, had struggled to find purpose after military service. The Foundation's work continued to expand in ways he could never have anticipated. Beyond Holocaust-era restitution, they had begun applying their expertise to other historical injustices, colonial-era looting, indigenous cultural property claims, and art theft during more recent conflicts. Each case represented not just valuable objects, but human connections disrupted by violence and injustice. This evolution reflected Michael's growing understanding that restoration was not merely about returning physical objects, but about healing the breaches in human connection and cultural continuity that violence creates. Whether addressing historical genocide or contemporary displacement, the Foundation's approach emphasized both practical restitution and the deeper healing that comes from acknowledgement, remembrance, and justice. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the lake, Michael thought again of Samuel Wellington, the soldier who had made a moral choice that continued to reverberate 75 years later. Wellington could never have imagined how his act of preservation would ultimately unfold, creating ripples of restoration that extended far beyond the 12 paintings he had hidden. In this realization lay perhaps the most profound lesson of Michael's journey, that moral choices made in darkness, often at great personal cost and with uncertain outcomes, can bear fruit in ways their makers never witness. Samuel Wellington had died never knowing whether his hidden paintings would complete their journey home, yet his act of preservation had created possibilities that continued to unfold decades after his death. For Michael, this understanding brought both humility and hope. The Foundation's work significant as it was represented just one link in a longer chain of moral action, stretching backward through Wellington's courage and forward into future generations represented by young people like his nephew. What had begun in a dilapidated garden shed with a homeless veteran's discovery had become something that transcended both the paintings themselves and Michael's personal transformation. It had become a testament to the persistent possibility of restoration even after devastating loss, a demonstration that while human history contains chapters of unimaginable darkness, it also includes the capacity for memory, justice, and healing that no violence can permanently extinguish. As Michael turned to walk back toward the house, he carried this understanding not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience. From homelessness to purpose, from isolation to connection, from despair to hope, his journey paralleled the path of the paintings themselves, emerging from darkness into light, from concealment into recognition, from separation into reunion. In this restoration lay the true treasure, far more valuable than even the masterworks that had initiated the journey, the recognition that healing remains possible even across decades, that justice delayed need not be justice denied, and that acts of moral courage continue to matter long after their immediate consequences have faded from view. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.